Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to the Everyday Missionary Podcast, and my name is Matt Boswell. I am the host of this podcast, and today, for those who are watching, you will notice that I have my turquoise shirt on. Yes, this is my go-to shirt when I just want to be kind of encouraged, right? So I'll wake up, I'll look outside, and if it's kind of dreary or rainy, or in our case, it's still smoky and kind of nasty, I'm like, I need to offset what's going on outside with something kind of chipper on the inside. And so I go for my yellow shirt, my turquoise shirt, some kind of happy, festive, joyful shirt. And so today I'm like, man, I'm going turquoise. That's the route I'm going. Now I'm doing this in part because I wanted to kind of feel a little chipper because I knew the topic that I was going into today was going to be maybe less than chipper. Now, I'm not saying it's a downer, it's drudgery, it's dreary, it's awful. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that it's probably going to be one of those topics that's going to be a little bit disquieting or challenging as we walk through it. I know for myself, as I've tried to process through it, I feel like I'm threading a really small hole in a needle with some rope. Like I feel like this is going to be a tough one to work through. And I might do this a couple of times between now and November because we are in an election cycle. And anytime we're talking about elections and politics and voting and parties, it can be instantly tense. And especially when the reins are off on rhetoric and the machine to drive a win on any side is up and running, there can just be an added amount of pressure and tension, frustration, whatever might go into play. Well, what I want to do today is I want to center us in an idea that I've been trying to work through for a while. And if I kind of get behind the scenes for a minute on this idea I've been working through, it's this idea of how we as followers of Jesus live with perpetual tension. This is why on this podcast, we called it the Everyday Missional Podcast and not the Every 4 Years Missional Podcast, because we know that every single day we face any number of challenges, and every single day as followers of Jesus, we're trying to figure out how we take the kingdom-mindedness of Jesus, the sacrificial example of Jesus, the biblical truth of Jesus, and then we live that out in a very problematic world. And I think part of this is acknowledging how deeply problematic the world is. See, when I think about like Deuteronomy, for example, we see that God says, when I bless you, there is flourishing, and when I curse you, there is decay. And so all of life is always on this push and pull of flourishing and decay. And in our world, that gets very murky and muddy sometimes on the flourishing versus decay model and what's God's blessing and what's God's kind of pulling away his blessing. We call it cursing, but I think really what you're talking about there is God saying, I'm just going to remove my protection, or I'm going to let you make your own decisions and face your own consequences and clean up your own messes in relationship to that, right? Like all of that's just sort of true in our world. And therefore, the reason that we're here as followers of Jesus is to inject that kingdom flourishing, to inject these values of Jesus that bring health and healing and peacemaking and wholeness and opportunity to a world that is perpetually sort of in motion and in battle, right? So our job is to be something different in the way the world does things, right? So this is why, as I love to share, most of Jesus's hardest, most riveting commands are to do things absolutely opposite of the world. So when people say something mean about you, you say something nice about them. When people want to take from you, you give to them. Like he is very clear about this. The way we change the world is opposites. Now, I say this because when we get into these election cycles, we get a little contaminated ourselves as Christians. In particular, I want to just square this up. I'm talking to us as evangelical Christians. We do end up starting to get into the mud of the system a little bit, and we start to think that the fire with fire fight is the way to go about securing some kind of flourishing future. And then with that, we forget sort of the commands of Jesus, and we take up the commands of the pundits. And we think that the real key to success is going to war against those we deal with in some capacity, as opposed to trying to figure out how we win over those who may want to go to war with us. Like we just get kind of trapped into earthly thinking and earthly rules and earthly solutions. And elections sort of ramp that up a little bit more. And maybe where I'm wanting to go a little bit deeper with this is not so much in the idea of elections itself, but it's in the criteria that sometimes gets applied during this time on what makes somebody truly Christian during a time of, voting or politics or elections or parties, right? Like, how does one prove they are really sold out to Jesus in times like this? So let me give you what kind of started this for me. This might have been about 3 weeks ago, maybe a month ago. I'm spitballing that one right now. But I was watching Dr. John MacArthur on the news. This was early on in the process where Grace Community Church, where he's a pastor, was going against the California governor's orders on churches that are meeting indoors and all of that, right? So this was all ramping up. And he was relating a conversation that he had had with President Trump. And so the president had called him and said, hey, way to stand up against California's governor and against, these orders that you can't open your church and everything else. And so Dr. MacArthur was sharing kind of what he had said to the president in the midst of the conversation. Now, let me give some backstory to this really quick. For a number of years, I've been very familiar with Dr. MacArthur, and his focus for much of that time has really not been on politics or anything political. He would oftentimes try to stay away from making political statements because he felt like the kingdom was a bigger context than American politics, and so he would really do that. But in recent years, he's definitely taken up more of a political voice, and he's definitely sided in a certain way with that political voice because he sees it as a clash of worldviews, right? And that we need to begin to be more politically active in protecting a certain type of worldview within our culture, right? I'm not taking issue with that necessarily in this podcast. That's not really my heart. But I want to get back to what he then said to the president when the president called him. He had related that the president needed to know that all true believers, if they're a true believer, would cast a vote for President Trump. Now, that issue is where I want to camp for a second. And I want to see if I can help us a little bit here by saying this podcast is not saying you're wrong if you vote for President Trump or you're right for voting for President Trump. What I want to kind of talk about here is the fact that for 2,000 years, we've had a Christian orthodoxy that says, here's what makes a true believer. A true believer is one who looks at the person of Jesus and says, Jesus is God. And Jesus came into the world, and Jesus lived a perfect life, and he died a sinner's death, and he rose from the grave to prove everything he said and did and accomplished was true. And if you would believe in the Lord Jesus Christ and yield your life to him and confess your sins, he saves you. And there is nothing in the gospel message that says, oh, and by the way, here's this other thing. You need to vote a certain way, and that shows you're a true believer. So instantaneously, for me, when I hear these ideas that, oh, well, this is how we know somebody's a true believer. They vote a certain way. They do certain things within society or whatever else. I instantly go, ding, 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 ding. Here's a problem for me. Here's a real big problem for me. We're adding to the gospel when we start to add these other additives in, which was something the Pharisees loved to do, right? They loved to add in additional things that they thought were good ideas, and they make them laws, and then those laws become the demarcation between true believers and fake believers, right? And so I heard this from Dr. MacArthur, and I thought, what an interesting thing that he's concluded that a vote for Trump is what a true believer would do. But somebody, I guess by extension, if they don't vote for Trump, let's say if they vote for Biden or they vote for the Green Party or they vote for the Socialist Party, whatever, let's say it's a leftist kind of thing, automatically he's saying that that's evidence you're not a true believer. True believers are going to go a certain route with this kind of thing. Now, obviously, the first problem I had was what I shared. As soon as we start saying, oh, and here's another way that you prove to us you're a believer, well, then we're adding to what the New Testament says is the proofs of a believer. Now, where I would agree with Dr. MacArthur is the proofs of a believer are going to be a certain heart and the desire to obey biblical commands and wanting to honor God in all that you do. And then in that acknowledging a certain level of humility that life is messy and you try to do the best you can by honoring Christ in whatever context you find yourself in. And it's never going to be super clean or super easily. And yet that's why I think I found myself struggling with this statement. He just made it very simple. True believers do this without any having to work through the problems or implications or anything else. It was just, this is what they do. And so this is where I want to kind of push on us as followers of Jesus to acknowledge something. When we all cast our vote at some point in the next couple of months, whether you vote liberal or conservative, Democrat or Republican, you vote third party, libertarian, whatever it is, the odds of every one of us in the process of making that decision, the odds of us sinning in that process are incredibly high, right? They're incredibly high. In fact, the more I try to work this through, the more I just realize that for us as Americans, when we cast that vote, there is an inability to do that in a pure, Jesus-oriented way. You have to sacrifice some ethics as you embrace others when you cast the vote. And here's why I think this is really, really important. I think it's important to acknowledge that there is no way to do this in an unmessy way, right? The very idea of what governance is in our world is sinners trying to help police other sinners because everybody's somehow going to be on the take. And laws, what laws are there to do is not to bring out, the better nature of our person. Laws are there to restrict the bad nature of our person, and that's why you have government and policies and everything else, right? So if we're really thinking about this, when we cast a vote, what we're saying is this is the most organized, sinful way to keep sin from getting worse. You know what I mean? Like that's what it comes down to. Or this party is the lesser sinful party to try to help keep the other sinful party honest. And that's true to both sides. Because what we want to remember is that every system, every politic, every ideology in this world, Jesus will dispense with one day. And I've been saying this on the podcast lately. Like he's not going to be like, oh, you know what? Like a representative republic is a great way to do the eternal state of heaven and earth. So I'm going to keep it that way. Like he doesn't do it that way. Right? In fact, oddly enough, in Revelation, we see it's kings. He rolls back to kings. He doesn't even use democracy. He uses kings of the nations, and then they come to the New Jerusalem. I don't understand the politic of the new heaven and new earth, but I know it's not American democracy, right? And so what I want us to have some humility in when it comes to our vote is that no matter how we vote, it's imperfect. And no matter how we vote, there is going to be a part of us that is in a process of being less than perfectly Jesus-like in that kind of giving of or casting of the ballot. Now, I know for some of you, you're going to, no, I don't agree. I don't believe it. I'm not with you, Matt. I think it's wrong. I think you can do that in a sinless sort of way. So let me see if I can kind of, again, roll back on this a little bit more and work this through. When I think about this upcoming election, I have to sit there and go, okay, so if I cast my ballot with any hint of fear, then I'm in sin, right? So if I fear protesters, if I fear lawlessness, if I fear a dictatorship out of the president, if I fear I'm not going to get health care, if I fear that the health care will go bankrupt because it's socialized, if I fear the government will not invest in the military and we need strong defense, if I fear terrorism, if I fear whatever, if I'm fearing, then I'm sinning, right? Now, that doesn't mean you can't be like, hey, I want to be thoughtful about this. We all have to plan, everything else. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about fear, because the Bible is really clear. If we fear God, we have nothing else to fear. Jesus is really clear. Why be anxious about what you will have tomorrow, what you will wear, what you will eat? So if we're like, I fear the economy issues will go bad, Jesus is like, well, that's sin. You're not supposed to fear about the economy. You're supposed to have faith in me. Trust me to provide for you. Pray that this day would be our daily bread. So again, if fear motivates us, that's problematic. Let's say it's something different. Let's say we're looking at the other side of our political views and we go, they make me angry and they need to be put in their place. They're crazy. They're out of line. They're reckless. They're silly. They're dumb. They're anti-science. They're anti-patriotic, whatever our thing may be. And we're looking at those who are on the other side of our belief system and we're judging them and we're angry at them and we kind of want to punish them and we certainly want to make sure they don't win and we don't have love for them, prayer for them, care for them, a desire to win them over with good, we're sinning. We're sinning. Here's another one. If we decide that this candidate is the only hope for our country, and if the other person wins, all is doomed, that's probably sin. Because we have to remember that kings rise and kings fall, countries rise and countries fall at the sovereign hand of God, right? And so in all these things, we want to be really, really careful. Not so much I'm saying try to cast a vote without sin. I'm saying I don't think you can cast a vote without sin. What I'm saying is let's not also cast that you're a sinner if you vote different than me, and by that you're not even a true believer, because true believers vote a certain way. That's where I'm thinking about Dr. MacArthur's words, where I go, that's just legalism. That's just adding a new criteria to the gospel. Because if we're really, really candid about the challenge that every person that is a follower of Jesus faces in the American political system is some things that are on the left, Jesus fought for, and some things that are on the right, Jesus fought for. And the problem is neither side wants to adopt everything Jesus fought for. Neither side wants to adopt every value Jesus held dear, right? And so then you and I are thrust into this world that says, I've got to choose between the values of Jesus, that group or that group often. Or we say, well, I don't want to throw my vote away, and that kind of whole speech and everything else. So we're put in a tough spot. And what matters more than whether you cast a D or an R or an L or anything in between, or you sit it out, comes back to your motives and your conscience. Because voting is gray, because voting requires some level of potential compromise or sin in the process of it. Right? I remember back in 2015 going into 2016 when the Republican field was really big. And so many evangelicals were never Trumpers because they said character matters and they didn't feel he had character. But when he was the guy, then they had to get behind him and they felt that it was like holding their nose or whatever else. And again, clearly an obvious display of there was really godly men in that lineup. And there was people that they would look at and say, that guy has been a lifelong Christian, real firm, and he didn't make it, but we're going to get behind this guy and everything else. And in the end, people felt like they were holding their nose and casting a vote because they would rather have President Trump than President Clinton again and everything else. Like, I understand that. But in the process of that, it wasn't like you're like, I'm making the most moral, godly decision ever. There was a sense of compromise. Okay, he doesn't have the character that I would prefer. Yeah, there's some things that he's done that I don't approve of, but I think he's going to be good for the country and everything else. It's that idea of compromise that ultimately is going to be the biggest challenge for everybody when they vote. And therefore, in this, we want to have a lot more humility, sensitivity, and understanding for however a person votes, because at the end of the whole thing, what is going to matter again is their motive and their conscience. If their motive is, Jesus, I am put in a tough spot and I'm trying to figure out what you most honor from 1 to 10, and I put it in terms of priority, one person's list may not be another person's list, right? One person may say, here's my priority. Number 1, the life of the unborn. That's my number 1 issue. Number 2, the economy, because I think economies help bring thriving to the world. Number 3, they have whatever it is, so they vote that direction. And there's going to be another person that says, you know what, man, my thing is really the poor and the foreigner, because that's such a big theme. 3,000 times taking care of the poor comes up in the Bible. So they go, the poor is really important to me. Equality is really important to me. God is a God of justice. And these are the top things for me. And man, it's tough because there's some other things that are important that the other side pushes. My side doesn't push. But boy, I'm stuck in a spot where I have to decide, is it A or is it B? And again, if your motive is saying, Jesus, I'm just trying to do my best to honor you in the decision I'm making, it's incomplete, it's imperfect. Forgive me for the imperfection of a tough decision I have to make. I believe that is the honorable and honoring thing that we have to engage in. And then with that, the other part is the conscience. If your conscience is not free to do X and it's only free to do Y, that's your conscience. And the thing we want to remember as followers of Jesus is that there are very diverse outplays of conscience in Christianity, not just in our own country, but globally. There's things that other Christians in other countries look at us and they go, how can you make that your order of priority? And they see it very, very different. And this is the diversity of the church and how the Spirit brings unity, even our diversity. And therefore, what we want to do is be ambassadors of the fact that, you know what, we go, I'm not going to get so sucked into elections will really shape the world for the better. Rather, we know that Jesus shapes the world for the better. And when we act like Jesus in a messy world, when we act like Jesus when it's problematic and challenging, that's what's really going to change things. Because here's what I really believe pretty firmly going into this election. I don't think it really matters how Christians vote. I think what matters is that Christians act like Christians however they vote. I think what's more important is that we look and sound like Jesus, whichever party we support. Which means we're not sounding like punks and jerks, and we're not mocking and shaming, and we're not talking about how true believers vote this way and non-believers vote that way. This is just more problematic than problem solving. Because at the core, we are exiles and strangers and aliens in a corrupt system known as Earth right now. And no vote will change that. No politician can fix that. No president will solve those problems. In fact, if anything, all of our political process shows is that this can't be solved by human might and power and wisdom. It just can't. It can only be solved by Jesus. And then I go back to what Jesus says and does and communicates to us, which is he does it different. He does it different. He loves the unlovely. He cares for his haters. He lays himself down for the betterment of those who are against him. He goes the extra mile, turns the other cheek, right? All of these things. He does really bless and love and do good to his enemy. Like, this is what we have to embody. And if we don't, if we say, you know what, it's just gloves off, I'm going to talk about how the other side of my opinion group is stupid, lazy, evil, Hitler-esque, whatever, you know what I mean? Immoral, unjust. Like, if we're going to use all those kinds of words, the world wins, Jesus loses. Our party may win, and the reputation of Jesus loses. See, politics for the Christian should be an opportunity to display grace. During these election cycles, it should be an opportunity for us to display calm, care, love, and faith. If we start talking about how scary, how bad, how those other people over there are misguided, immoral, and rotten, and we're just sounding like earthly people, that's all people are going to hear is earthly people. But they're going to hear earthly people claiming to do this in the name of Christ, sounding nothing like Jesus. Nothing. And so what I'm desperate for is not anything pertaining to who wins the next election. I'm desperate to see us as his church sound like him in the cacophony of earthliness that is an election. That we wouldn't contribute to the problem, but rather we would show the world a different type of solution, an otherworldly type of solution, where we can really embody and incarnate this idea of how Jesus engaged with and invested in people that were estranged from God's ways and estranged from the life that God offers, that we would be the solution spiritually to the problem that is earthly. And so my encouragement, brothers and sisters and friends and followers of Jesus, is that we would honestly look ourselves in the mirror and say, what matters most? What actually matters most? What is going to change the hate of our world? What is going to change the vitriol that we feel and sense? What is going to change angry hearts that want to destroy cities, or angry hearts that want to close borders, or angry hearts that want to do whatever angry hearts want to do, whether it be Antifa or white nationalists or whatever it is? Where can we be different? How can we be different? And how do we as individuals begin to embody that? Because when we really do the homework and we look deep and we resolve to actually be more of Jesus and less of a Republican or less of a Democrat, the more that Jesus' church will turn the tide and really begin to display what it looks like to be everyday missionaries.